Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez believed her meticulously forged political defenses were utterly unbreakable, right up until the moment Senator John Kennedy dismantled her entire worldview using nothing but a plain manila folder and a single, catastrophic inquiry regarding her on-camera weeping. She had previously possessed the audacity to look a sitting U.S. senator in the eye and declare that his particular age demographic had irrevocably ruined the nation. Throughout her tenure, she had aimed significantly more venomous rhetoric at vastly more influential targets, always emerging completely unscathed. She had navigated aggressive cable news hosts, unforgiving committee leaders, an adversarial commander-in-chief, perpetual meme cycles, viral trends, and the absolute fatigue of serving as the most micro-analyzed, sound-bited, and screenshotted federal lawmaker in contemporary American politics. Despite all of this, her aura of absolute political invulnerability could not withstand a 35-minute confrontation with John Kennedy. The Louisiana senator's victory wasn't achieved by dragging convoluted Federal Election Commission paperwork into the chamber. It wasn't the result of presenting devastating ethical violations. Instead, he wielded a weapon vastly more fatal. He arrived armed with a standard folder brimming with her very own verbatim statements, precisely printed, rigorously time-stamped, and arranged for direct comparison. During that brief half-hour window, Senator Kennedy didn't even have to actively debate the Congresswoman. He merely stepped back and permitted her to debate her own past self. Get ready to see the exact fallout when a veteran lawmaker cracks open a file of a representative's verbatim remarks and recites them in strict chronological sequence, turning the passage of time itself into an unbeatable counterattack. It is absolutely vital for the viewing public to grasp exactly who was dominating the microphone earlier in the day, Mr. Chairman, because historical backdrop is everything in these high-stakes legislative clashes. Ocasio-Cortez was precisely 9 minutes deep into a blistering opening monologue that her PR staff had obsessively designed as a massive condemnation of an entire generation. She wasn't merely aiming her fire at the panel or the GOP opposition. She was launching a full-scale assault on the very foundation of the United States Senate. Within the walls of room 226 inches, the Dirksen Senate Office building, under the glare of live C-SPAN cameras, and with every major news outlet prepping their dual-feed broadcasts, the stage was flawlessly set for a political bloodbath. Seated at the witness desk, AOC projected the precise body language of a political operative who had devoted the last 8 years to perfecting the visual medium of government. Her physical stance was essentially the core of her messaging. Her chin was tipped sharply upward, her shoulders were pitched forward in an attacking stance, and her hands were kept in clear view, hovering and prepared to animate her words instantaneously. Every inch of her frame was meticulously calibrated for maximum on-screen impact. Flawlessly positioned for the half-dozen distinct camera angles C-SPAN routinely utilizes for these blockbuster hearings. Exactly 10 minutes in, she shifted her glare away from the general panel and stared directly into the eyes of Senator Kennedy. Utilizing a vocal register that mixed profound moral superiority with tactical lethality, she launched her offensive. She informed him, with highly conditional respect, that he stood for an era of lawmakers who had wasted decades talking in circles while the globe was literally incinerating, while working-class citizens were driven into poverty by insurmountable healthcare debts, and while her demographic was forced to shoulder the crushing weight of $1.7 trillion in educational loans. She acutely highlighted his 8-year tenure in the upper chamber and aggressively questioned what tangible things he had managed to construct. From her vantage point, she asserted, he did nothing but pose witty inquiries and spin rural anecdotes, while the status quo remained entirely unchanged. Her vocal pitch hit that optimal frequency specifically engineered for social media virality, proclaiming that while his cohort had destroyed the republic, hers was frantically attempting to repair the damage. She dared him to look closely at his own record and his absolute lack of past legislation before having the audacity to interrogate her. From the seating area nestled behind the progressive aides, a distinct, rapid wave of whispered validation moved through the space. It was the unmistakable acoustic signature of devoted followers getting the exact religious affirmation they had been so desperately anticipating. However, the massive hypocrisy of the moment was entirely ignored. The individual vocally scolding a U.S. senator for a lack of results had actually participated in bipartisan lawmaking, the sixth least frequently among all Democratic House members. according to GovTrack data. Moreover, throughout her entire 8-year career in the federal government, she had successfully championed absolutely zero pieces of legislation that actually became law. Positioned 5 seats away from the dead center of the committee platform, the senator from Louisiana, John Neely Kennedy, was outfitted in a dark suit paired with a blue necktie that was perhaps slightly too broad. His expression remained entirely placid and undisturbed, the look of a veteran who had just been dismissed as obsolete by an individual whose inflated media presence completely dwarfed her real legislative impact and who had endured vastly worse insults from significantly more important figures. Resting openly on the surface of his table was a manila folder, incredibly ordinary in appearance, featuring handwritten tabs far too small for anyone in the audience to read. At a glacial pace, he reached up for his reading spectacles, removed them from his bridge, and elevated them toward the harsh overhead illumination. He tugged his tie loose from the confines of his jacket and started to obsessively wipe the left piece of glass. 3 unhurried, calculated circular motions. It was the silent, systematic habit of a craftsman preparing his implements, because preparing your tools is precisely what is required before deploying them for serious labor. He repositioned the spectacles on his face and locked eyes with AOC for roughly 2 seconds past the point of normal social etiquette. He initiated his response by expressing genuine appreciation for her intensity, pointing out that in his home state of Louisiana, such fire is highly respected. But he swiftly amended that statement, noting that they also have a deep reverence for factual precision, and tragically, those 2 vital characteristics frequently fail to walk hand in hand. He fluidly opened the nondescript file, advising her that he hadn't bothered to haul in dense economic spreadsheets or ethical investigations on this occasion. He had arrived with something vastly superior. Flipping to the initial document, he brought up October of 2019, recalling a distinct instance when a journalist pressed her on Representative Tulsi Gabbard's heavily criticized choice to cast a present vote during the Trump impeachment proceedings. Reading verbatim from the recorded dialogue, Kennedy recited her exact answer. "We are sent here to lead." He placed that solitary printed page flat against the wood, its date heavily circled in blue marker. He repeated her former conviction. Choosing to vote present represents a total dereliction of sworn duty. An elected official is required to take a definitive stand, either affirmative or negative, and fearlessly absorb the resulting political blowback. To hide behind a present vote is sheer cowardice, those were her precise, undeniable words. Without pausing for breath, the senator extracted a second piece of evidence. The timestamp read the 23rd of September 2021. A day when the legislative body was conducting an isolated vote to allocate $1 billion in crucial financial support for Israel's Iron Dome defensive grid. Kennedy refreshed the quiet chamber's memory, noting that AOC had dedicated the entirety of the prior week to leading a fierce crusade to remove that exact financial allocation from a massive, generalized spending package. She had achieved her goal of isolating it. Yet, when the solitary vote finally took place, her tight-knit allies in the squad, Congresswomen Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, courageously cast no votes. They held their ground and embraced the fallout, while Kennedy stared straight at AOC and declared the irrefutable reality: she had chosen to vote present. He situated the 2021 statement directly adjacent to the 2019 declaration. 2 distinct documents, 2 separate timestamps, separated by exactly 24 months, their borders were now physically colliding on the glossy mahogany surface. Back in the fall of 2019, she boldly proclaimed they were elected to lead. By the fall of 2021, she cowered into a present vote. Kennedy quietly observed that these 2 sheets of paper were presently engaging in a fierce debate right there on his desk, and he wasn't even required to interject. The Congresswoman's hands, which had been vigorously directing the energy of the room with highly rehearsed accuracy ever since her initial statement, abruptly halted in mid-air. Her right hand had been elevating into a broad flourish, the exposed palm motion she constantly utilized to telegraph deep ethical certainty, but it suddenly locked in place right at the level of her chest. It hovered there in limbo, remarkably similar to a maestro whose musicians had just struck a devastatingly incorrect chord. That particular motion was never finished. It lingered in the heavy atmosphere for roughly 1 agonizing second, just enough time for the wide C-SPAN camera to permanently archive it before it gradually descended back to the desk. It remained there, exuding the strained, artificial paralysis of an appendage that has just received direct neurological orders to completely shut down its routine until further notice. However, the senator wasn't through. He extracted a third document, pointing out that the Iron Dome controversy didn't simply conclude with a cowardly abstention. Following that specific roll call, cameras recorded her shedding tears uncontrollably on the chamber floor. The national broadcast network captured the weeping. CNN played the footage continuously, and the highly theatrical moment was circulated more than 11 million times across the internet. In the wake of that monumental public performance, she authored an extensive 4-page dispatch to her voters, a document significantly lengthier than her hallmark Green New Deal legislation, where she intensely apologized for her abstention and tried to meticulously rationalize her widely circulated crying spell. Following that was the fourth piece of evidence, fast-forwarding to the year 2024, when a fresh legislative rider was introduced with the goal of slashing Iron Dome resources entirely. On this occasion, she flipped her position entirely and cast a vote against the rider, essentially functioning to protect the exact same financial support she had previously battled to remove, abstained from voting on, and openly sobbed regarding. As a final blow, Kennedy brought forth sheet number 5, a mere 4 weeks prior, in April of 2026, during an untelevised gathering with the NYC branch of the Democratic Socialists of America. She was captured on a hot mic. This audio was rapidly leaked by city and state publications. In the clip, she swore to oppose any and all military funding for Israel, specifically calling out defensive systems like the Iron Dome. The senator carefully aligned all 5 pieces of paper in a flawless, inescapable sequence across his workspace. 5 separate dates. 5 entirely opposing policy stances. It was a catastrophic chronological record constructed entirely out of physical documents. In 2021, she wanted to gut the funding. In 2021, she voted present instead of officially opposing it. Later in 2021, she wept over the outcome and drafted a massive excuse letter. By 2024, she voted to preserve the funding, and by 2026, she swore to completely block it all over again. Staring right into her eyes, the senator brought up a down-home story regarding his buddy Boudreaux from the town of Madisonville. Boudreaux completely rejected the concept of New Year's resolutions, reasoning that any grand commitments he established in January were consistently shattered by his own actions come March. Kennedy painted a harsh, unavoidable comparison. Her 2019 persona aggressively guaranteed leadership, while her 2021 persona meekly cast a present vote. Her 2024 persona totally flipped the script, and her 2026 persona swore to undo that exact same flip. This dynamic, Kennedy pointed out, cannot be categorized as ideological growth, because growth naturally requires a consistent, progressive trajectory. This exact pattern of conduct is the textbook description of a weather vane. It swivels in whatever direction the current breeze pushes it, and in her particular situation, the breeze perpetually shifts toward whoever happens to be sitting in her immediate audience. AOC's highly raised chin, the combative stance of a politician who walks into spaces fully assuming she will organically control them unintentionally, lowered by roughly 2 degrees. It was the almost invisible bodily recalibration of an individual swiftly comprehending that her original tactical approach was no longer physically justifiable. It was the involuntary twitch of cervical muscles that had been sustaining a stiff posture, suddenly processing emergency data that the foundation was completely buckling. She wasn't yielding in surrender. She was wildly trying to adapt. Snapped by the merciless, crystal-clear focus of C-SPAN's secondary camera, this micro-adjustment communicated to the entire viewing public that the politician who started on the attack was now frantically trying to figure out which way was up. Kennedy effortlessly flipped to the next page, redirecting the spotlight onto the incidents of January the 6th. He delivered a cautious, calibrated introduction, clearly stating that genuine, terrifying brutality took place that afternoon, that actual law enforcement personnel were brutally harmed, and that he harbored zero desire to downplay that dark truth. However, he extracted yet another physical transcript. On January 12th of 2021, the Congresswoman had utilized Instagram Live to narrate her terrifying ordeal, directly informing her massive online following that she genuinely believed her life was about to end. She claimed it was not hyperbole to declare that numerous congressional representatives were almost murdered. She had colorfully detailed an aggressive individual pounding on the door of her suite, screaming to locate her, which left her petrified and sheltering in her washroom, while witnessing pure rage and malice in the intruder's eyes. The senator then produced the next catastrophic document, smoothly disclosing that the allegedly aggressive individual she had detailed was, in reality, a valiant officer of the United States Capitol Police who was frantically attempting to escort her to a fortified position. This is the standard operational procedure during a catastrophic perimeter failure. They sweep from office to secure personnel. The panic and supposed malice she interpreted in his gaze was nothing more than the desperate biological drive of a sworn protector in uniform, endeavoring to shield a federal lawmaker. Adding to this, Kennedy mapped out the undeniable physical layout of the complex. Her workspace was situated inside the Cannon House office building. The Cannon facility is unequivocally not the primary Capitol structure. It is a completely distinct edifice positioned across the roadway, linked solely via a subterranean walkway. The destructive mob forcefully penetrated the Capitol, yet they never once breached the perimeter of the Cannon building. Kennedy set down a statement from Representative Nancy Mace, whose own suite was located a mere 2 doors away down that exact same corridor. Mace had went on the record to explicitly confirm that rioters had never, at any point, infiltrated their particular hallway. A distance of 2 doors resulted in 2 completely conflicting, incompatible narratives. The senator made sure to emphasize that he wasn't negating her genuine feelings of panic. The whole legislative campus was under a security alert, and any individual within that perimeter possessed a legitimate reason to be horrified. He himself was present inside the Senate room that afternoon and intimately grasped the true nature of terror. However, he established a rigid, uncompromising boundary. There is an immense gap between experiencing authentic fear and deceptively transmitting to the citizens of America that you were nearly murdered when you were physically situated in a totally separate facility, and the person violently pounding on your entrance was a badged cop dispatched to preserve your life. Kennedy stopped for a moment, deliberately measuring his phrasing, intensely cognizant that these words would be isolated, rebroadcast, and required to endure the fierce digital news environment. He then circled back to the year 2019, raising the topic of her heavily covered trip to a migrant holding center near the southern boundary of the country. Images of her clutching a metal chain-link barrier, noticeably heartbroken with tears pouring down her cheeks, had circulated the entire planet. These were psychologically crushing pictures that massively dictated the ensuing domestic conversation surrounding border policy. Yet, Kennedy highlighted the highly problematic reality that later journalistic digging and expanded frame pictures finally exposed. She wasn't actually positioned in front of a holding center. She wasn't gazing at incarcerated minors. She was theatrically weeping into a vacant vehicle lot with a basic street lying beyond it. He made it clear he wasn't challenging the reality of her inner sadness, but rather the glaring truth of her physical location. Because, as they say back in Madisonville, you are free to weep over whatever shatters your spirit, but if you are actively going to guarantee that lenses record those emotional breakdowns, you ought to verify that you are actually facing the correct object. Right at this specific second, the Congresswoman's respiration noticeably altered. It wasn't a dramatic, loud intake of air that video directors try to catch, but a profound biological reset. Her calculated, restrained orator's breathing, the variety that enables vocal power and stops a speaker's voice from fracturing under immense stress, shattered into much shorter, highly superficial bursts. Her nasal passages expanded by a tiny fraction, a silent adjustment by an organic network desperately requesting additional oxygen because her mind had accurately concluded that the upcoming minute would demand vastly more energy than the preceding one. Her legal counsel, detecting the looming collapse, shifted forward a fraction, resting a hand close to her sleeve in a quiet display of physical solidarity. There was absolutely zero tactical or judicial guidance left to offer because the cited statements were brutally precise. The timelines were an inescapable matter of public archive, and the topographical realities were completely confirmable. Total, inflexible paralysis was the only remaining functional defense mechanism. Kennedy, wielding the natural pacing of an elite courtroom litigator, allowed the dead air to hover heavily over the proceedings. He permitted the undeniable paradoxes to soak in, side by side on his table. He fully comprehended that pure, irrefutable proof seldom requires raised volume. It merely needs to be clearly showcased and granted sufficient room to expand. Room for the viewing public to scan it, room for the chamber to process it, and room for the witness to sit helplessly caught in the vast chasm between her proclaimed version of events and the geographic reality that inevitably proves otherwise. Before advancing, Kennedy provided one last, muted comparison concerning the Capitol riot. He extracted an additional page, not a verbatim statement this round, but a private juxtaposition. During the events of January 6th, he was physically present directly inside the chamber of the United States Senate. He wasn't across the roadway, nor was he in a secondary facility. When the perimeter failed, he was ushered by security forces through the highly volatile subterranean corridors beneath the complex. He saw law enforcement officers with firearms unholstered, and he listened to horrifying sounds that he outright declined to graphically illustrate for a broadcast audience, reasoning that those agonizing memories were the exclusive property of the individuals who survived them, rather than content for the general populace. When he ultimately returned to his residence that evening, he merely phoned his spouse to confirm his safety. He didn't boot up an Instagram live stream, nor did he disseminate a story about dodging death. He refrained from informing the nation that he had been the target of an assassination. He simply went to his house, called his partner, and quietly returned to his duties the following morning. He stressed that this reality didn't make him intrinsically more courageous than her. It simply indicated that he at his core understood that genuine psychological damage is a deeply personal recollection, rather than easily consumable digital fodder optimized for a ravenous online algorithm. AOC's left hand, which had been laying closest to her lawyer in a state of mandated paralysis, finally gave her away. Her pointer and middle digits elevated precisely 1 centimeter above the surface and struck the timber twice. 2 diminutive, quick beats. It was the frantic, subconscious cadence of a severely overloaded neural pathway attempting to find an unapproved release valve. She crushed the movement immediately, pressing her fingers flat once more, but the merciless C-SPAN zoom lens had been intensely locked onto her digits ever since the Iron Dome sequence. Those 2 microscopic, accidental strikes signaled to 20 million spectators that her ostensibly tranquil facade was swiftly tearing apart at the seam. Her paralysis was purely an act of containment, and that containment was starting to visibly fracture. Flipping yet another document, the senator fluidly transitioned to legislative strategy, deliberately zeroing in on her hallmark Green New Deal. He produced a widely recognized statement from a February 2019 sit-down on the 60 Minutes program with journalist Anderson Cooper. When pushed to explain how the federal budget could possibly absorb a gigantic initiative projected by legitimate financial experts to run anywhere from $51 to $93 trillion, her cavalier, televised comeback was that her detractors merely resembled the cinematic villain Dr. Evil. Kennedy recited the statement at a crawl, allowing the sheer ridiculousness of the moment to suspend heavily in the environment. That was her exhaustive economic blueprint for the most colossal requested payout in the history of the United States government. A sluggish pop culture joke. The individuals posing those grave financial inquiries were not fabricated movie antagonists, the senator clarified. They consisted of the objective Congressional Budget Office, top-tier economists from Wharton, and her very own progressive peers sitting on the House budget panel. She offered them a comedic punchline in place of a structural plan. Kennedy then spotlighted the savage legislative reality using the GovTrack dossier. Throughout her entire 8 years in office, the Green New Deal never even received a floor vote from the wider House of Representatives. It completely failed to become binding law, and despite her outward PR campaigns absorbing credit for elements inside the Inflation Reduction Act, that specific bill possessed absolutely 0 elements sourced from her Green New Deal. After 8 years serving in the federal legislature, she had precisely 0 authored bills signed into the Federal Registry. A total goose egg. She had flawlessly perfected the skill of debuting flashy proposals, delivering explosive monologues, and spinning up historic digital engagement that smashed congressional benchmarks, yet her tangible, quantifiable lawmaking production was a dead 0. He then unleashed another catastrophic rural analogy concerning Boudreau's relative Thibodeau, who constructed a stunning white barrier encircling his land. He snapped beautiful photos for his online profiles, and everyone down at the local tackle shop praised it relentlessly. The single disastrous error was that he had never taken the time to sink any physical posts into the dirt. The initial gust of heavy wind blew the entire structure completely over. It appeared flawless in the photographs, Kennedy wrapped up. But much like that barrier, the Green New Deal utterly failed to survive contact with the real world. Incapable of sustaining yet another punishing strike, the Congresswoman aggressively tilted forward toward her audio receiver. It was the abrupt, aggressive shift of a physical form that had hit its maximum capacity for taking on damaging data and urgently required a return to attack mode. Her jaw parted, and the initial phonetic sound of the title Senator materialized on her rigid mouth. Kennedy didn't yell, he didn't slam a heavy wooden mallet, and he didn't even elevate his vocal volume. He merely lifted one solitary pointer finger exactly 2 inches above the wood of his desk. The action was astonishingly slight, a movement so incredibly subtle that anyone positioned further than 10 rows deep in the audience completely overlooked it. But the crystal-clear broadcast lenses captured every pixel, and AOC undoubtedly registered the impact. The digit didn't shake or aim in a hostile manner, it merely elevated 2 inches and maintained its territory, causing the phonetic sound to perish immediately upon her lips. Her jaw hung open for one solitary beat before clamping shut firmly. She retreated backward, not due to any physical menace from the tiny gesture, but because it was loaded with the crushing, irrefutable command of an individual who had politely remained in absolute quiet for 25 minutes while she held the floor. He had legitimately purchased the silence of the chamber, and he was currently cashing in that accrued capital on one single, silent demand for her to hold on. And she held on. The entire space observed in shocked awe as a politician who had dedicated almost a decade to rebelling against being muted by influential commanders-in-chief, booming television pundits, or legions of daily internet harassers, was utterly neutralized by a 74-year-old gentleman from the deep South elevating a single finger 2 inches into the air. It wasn't the sour quiet of an explosive loss. It was the bone-chilling quiet of naked realization. Within those 4 walls, genuine power wasn't determined by subscriber metrics, online spread, or the natural talent for creating flashy broadcast snippets. It was distributed through sheer endurance, and Kennedy's endurance had progressively banked up, transforming that lone digit into a colossal payout. By this 4th act, AOC's physical metamorphosis was utterly finalized. The hostile, forward-pitched stance, the elevated chin, the attacking shoulder, geometry, all of it was a faded memory. The appendages that had boldly orchestrated the space were currently plastered and inert against the wood. She was currently an official agonizingly cornered within her own impeccably archived hypocrisies, frozen because every single divergent, clashing iteration of her political identity was splayed out openly across Kennedy's workspace. Dropping his hand, the senator altered the climate of the chamber yet again as the atmosphere became noticeably denser. He tilted inward, dropping his cheerful, anecdotal demeanor as his upper body rolled forward a fraction. His deep Southern cadence dropped into a hushed, closer, and profoundly intimate register. He touched upon the unwritten, forbidden subject of contemporary governance, interrogating a public official's heavily broadcasted feelings. He validated that mortal feelings are organically private and gorgeously personal, yet he flagged a massive, profoundly awkward inconsistency. Her weeping almost never remained behind closed doors. It constantly appeared to magically materialize at the precise second the cameras were flawlessly zoomed in on her. Without even having to reference his paperwork, he rattled off the historical trend from flawless, raw recall. September 23, 2021, sobbing on the congressional floor following the Iron Dome tally, recorded by C-SPAN and beamed to 11 million viewers. June of 2019, weeping openly exterior to a migrant camp, with the pictures distributed globally. Numerous instances of crying on the legislative floor while monologuing about border laws, weeping during addresses regarding the environmental emergency, and shedding tears throughout the State of the Union. The senator made it clear he wasn't labeling her a cold-blooded sociopath. He authentically trusted that she experienced emotions intensely. However, he had invested decades observing unfiltered human misery inside justice halls, in legislative chambers, and in impoverished Madisonville dining rooms where parents detailed why the food funds had vanished. And he had explicitly recognized a massive divergence. Her weeping supernaturally occurred exactly when 4 dozen recording devices were active in the vicinity. He presented a reasonable alternative, proposing that perhaps it was merely a bizarre twist of fate that her deepest feelings only emerged while on the clock in front of media equipment. But he leaned closer with authentic reverence and dropped a devastating critique. The individuals who legitimately endure the most profound, excruciating trauma almost never elect to endure it while being recorded. The folks who experience trauma the most acutely are the ones who pardon themselves, step into a secluded restroom, secure the latch, and return a few moments later sporting bloodshot eyes and a raspy vocal tone, quietly asking for forgiveness before permanently burying the subject. Her weeping, he pointed out, functioned on an entirely distinct, heavily monetized ecosystem. They showed up right on schedule, were recorded in stunning clarity, produced massive waves of pity, triggered enormous press coverage and frantic donation appeals, and then they completely ceased. The media narrative rotated, the legislative stance was quietly flipped, and the previous weeping was immediately erased from memory. The Congresswoman's broadcast perfect facial geometry, sharpened across thousands of sessions of rigorous PR grooming to appear utterly flawless beneath government bulbs, commenced a visible structural breakdown. Her forehead loosened into an empty, hollow vacancy, while her lips sealed shut into the standard posture of an individual who no longer anticipates being addressed. The composite result was a visage that had been executing a complicated theatrical algorithm for 25 solid minutes and had just caught a lethal system crash. She appeared identical to a digital monitor viciously locked up between two competing programs. The senator spoke quietly regarding the authentic, unseen agony within his native territory. Citizens watching everything they possess get wiped out by horrific storms and never receiving their disaster relief, mothers and fathers heartbreakingly laying to rest offspring who suffered fatal overdoses, and former military personnel agonizing in silent gloom while lingering 4 months for a medical consultation. Those individuals weep in pitch-black dining rooms and vehicles at 2 in the morning where absolutely zero cameras are rolling. Nobody is slicing the video for social media traction, and nobody is composing a 4-page email blast regarding the event. Genuine tears, he drilled in, do not achieve trending status, nor do they accumulate 11 million clicks. Genuine tears are absolutely, unequivocally not content. Then, locking onto her with the penetrating stare of an individual who has dedicated his existence to dissecting theatrical earnestness, he posed the final, inescapable inquiry. Ma'am, my question is simple. When was the last time you cried and nobody saw it? A total of 6 seconds evaporated. Then it became 7, 8, 9, 10, and finally 11 excruciating seconds of total suffocating silence inside a space jammed with 40 active recording devices. The Congresswoman's gaze frantically zipped around. She refrained from staring down at the wood in humiliation. She didn't look to her legal team for guidance, nor did she stare at her own digits. Operating purely on raw, unfiltered reflex, forged through 8 years of total media dominance, her gaze fired instantly toward camera 3, the left flank C-SPAN response lens situated low and broad. She peered into the frigid glass optic, praying for the affirmation she had perpetually extracted from her viewership. She gazed at that lens in the exact manner one stares into a looking glass when the glass reflects an image they were entirely unprepared to witness. Yet, the recording device provided zero solace, because recording devices never do. They simply absorb and never give back. She diverted her eyes from the equipment, finally gazing downward at her utterly motionless fingers, compelled to process the unimaginable, gaping void separating her manicured online theater from tangible, quantifiable reality. The senator harbored no need to boast or pack the dead air. He simply shut his manila file. "I tell stories, ma'am," he remarked softly. "You perform them." He then surrendered the remainder of his clock back to the presiding chair without posing another inquiry. When Chairman Grassley ultimately granted her the floor to counter, the Congresswoman unsurprisingly unleashed a highly rehearsed 2-minute and 7-second diatribe. She fiercely painted the entire interrogation as a profoundly sexist assault on a female's inherent liberty to showcase feeling in a public forum. She fervently brought up the environmental emergency, the crushing weight of collegiate debt, and the deep-rooted double standards inflicted by a male-dominated society. It was a masterfully engineered segment of public speaking, flawlessly crafted to supply left-leaning pundits with defensive ammunition and spawn its own rebellious online snippets. However, it tackled absolutely zero items of actual merit, completely bypassing the catastrophic Iron Dome chronology. She sidestepped the irrefutable topographical truth of the Cannon facility versus the Central Capitol complex, and she ignored the vacant vehicle lot at the border. She bypassed her absolute void of past laws and the metaphorical Green New Deal barrier lacking foundational posts, and she utterly evaded the lethal inquiry regarding her unrecorded weeping. Kennedy didn't so much as blink. He peacefully collapsed his spectacles, tucked them safely into his jacket pocket, offered the audience a slight, knowing gesture that essentially communicated "you heard what I heard," and strolled out of the room without ever looking back. The printed documents had already executed the mission. Within a matter of hours, the digital landscape was completely overrun by the video segments. The brief 1.4-second weather vane snippet concerning the missile defense grid amassed 23 million hits immediately, quickly morphing into an aggressive digital campaign financed by the NRCC, specifically aimed at her local NY14 constituency. The parking lot segment sparked a colossal 7-2-hour media blaze, featuring left-wing voices crying sexism while right-wing voices cheered the ultimate exposure. The fence without posts analogy transformed into the standard shorthand for prominent editorial boards ridiculing the massive chasm between far-left ideas and tangible legislative results. However, the fourth segment, the savage 11 ticks of deafening quiet where she wildly hunted for camera 3, was the actual killing blow that would haunt her professional life into eternity. It demanded absolutely zero analytical translation. Her raw, unedited instinct to hunt down a camera during an instance of intense internal panic served as the absolute visual proof regarding the empty soul of performative governance. The resulting political damage was mathematically devastating. Surveys conducted after the showdown displayed a historic 1-1-point crash in her most critical category, says what she believes. Her baseline of presumed genuineness tanked to 60%, causing top-tier 2028 election architects to wildly revise their dossiers, recognizing she wasn't merely susceptible, but an enormous liability on any debate stage. The senator had practically open-sourced a lethal new campaign weapon, the chronological quotation file. It is completely impossible to shield yourself against your own verbatim statements, because arguing with yourself is the absolute essence of suffering a defeat. The defense mounted by the squad was unsurprisingly shattered. While allies like Rashida Tlaib shrieked regarding male-dominated oppression, Ilhan Omar, who had actually held her ground and cast a negative vote on the missile grid, kept a deafeningly calculated quiet that resonated vastly louder than any official statement could possibly achieve. Left-wing publications started splintering, with Jacobin publicly asking if viral instances were completely pointless if they yielded precisely zero binding legislation. A neighborhood blog in Jackson Heights delivered the most degrading local strike, releasing an explosive report demonstrating that AOC hadn't hosted a local, open-door community meeting in 14 months, choosing to prioritize coast-to-coast media hits over constituent aid by an astounding 7-2 margin. The deep, tangible shockwaves of those painful 11 seconds weren't just restricted to the stone corridors of D.C. They echoed outward, dropping heavily into the hushed, everyday environments across the Republic, where normal citizens navigated their genuine lives. In Queens, New York, Rosa Gutierrez was systematically locking up her modest nail parlor for the night. The severe overhead bulbs buzzed over her head as she sanitized the workstations, her hands throbbing from yet another punishing 14-hour shift of manual labor. Via the compact screen attached to the corner of her business, she viewed the catastrophic replay of the committee meeting. When the Congresswoman's eyes wildly hunted for the lens during that deafening silence, Rosa halted her scrubbing. She wiped her exhausted hands, retrieved her mobile device from her smock, launched her Act Blue program, and quietly, purposefully terminated her automated monthly campaign contribution. It was a profound instance of silent realization for her. She had dedicated her whole adult existence to laboring intensely for every lone dollar she banked, and she abruptly recognized a core reality regarding legislative treason. She calculated that while terrible, crooked lawmakers merely squander civilian tax dollars, a vastly more insidious type of official completely falsifies their foundational moral compass. For Rosa, a meticulously manufactured identity, a highly refined online mirage engineered to exploit blue-collar empathy, was endlessly harder to pardon than a squandered $16. $16 merely represented an hour of intense work, but a fabricated identity equated to a robbery of her authentic faith, a theft of her profound conviction that someone in authority legitimately gave a damn about her life rather than solely caring about their digital metrics. Hundreds of miles distant, inside the shadowy, hushed recreation room of the Brighter Days Recovery Center in Middletown, Ohio, the vibe held a distinctly different flavor of heavy clarity. Crystal and Donna, a pair of females who had navigated the terrifying battlegrounds of extreme chemical dependency, sat gripping their tepid coffee mugs as they viewed the identical network rerun on a tiny, glitching television. They weren't dissecting the government showdown through the slick perspective of campaign tactics or PR maneuvering. They were analyzing AOC's frantic actions through the dark, relentless lens of hardcore addiction. As they watched those 11 seconds of absolute quiet, they immediately identified her wild, panic-fueled stare at the broadcast lens. In the savage reality of rehab, they possessed a highly specific vocabulary. They referred to it as the reach. It constitutes the tragic, completely subconscious physical twitch of a severely overwhelmed, horrified addict automatically grabbing for the exact venomous material that was actively obliterating their existence. The broadcast lens served as her absolute sanctuary, her primary narcotic, the sole tool she comprehended how to deploy to medicate herself when her physical reality started to cave in. Inside that chamber, the senator hadn't merely posed a difficult inquiry. He had mercilessly and systematically severed her main oxygen line for 11 excruciating ticks, utterly peeling back her fabricated armor and laying bare the pitch-black, horrifying emptiness that existed underneath the heavily practiced routine. Meanwhile, outside the chaotic center of the nation's capital, past the heavy doors of the Dirksen Senate building, the architect of this political earthquake made a peaceful exit. A breathless journalist caught up with Senator Kennedy on the crowded pavement, thrusting a microphone forward to ask if the explosive hearing was fruitful. Kennedy maintained his steady pace, pausing only to remove his glasses and methodically wipe them with his wide blue tie. Offering a modest smile, he calmly explained that he hardly spoke. He merely sat back and let the Congresswoman do the heavy lifting, pointing out the reality that she simply didn't realize her aggressively contradictory statements were safely stored in his manila folder. As he turned toward the elevators, unbothered by the media storm, he offered one final piece of rural wisdom. The most catastrophic argument you can ever win is the one your opponent actively wages against themselves. You don't need to shout. You just need the quiet endurance to stay silent and let it unfold. If you watched this far, you witnessed a masterclass in political deconstruction. You saw a seasoned narrator dismantle a premier actor using the freezing gravity of her own track record. Smash the like button if you agree that a politician's own memory is their most lethal vulnerability. Subscribe for more deep dives into modern governance, and share this with anyone who suspects televised political tears vanish when cameras stop rolling. Sound off below. What was the ultimate knockout blow? The Iron Dome weather vane, the baseless Green New Deal fence, the empty parking lot, or those 11 seconds of dead air? Stories possess truth. Performances demand endless maintenance. God bless hardworking Americans who process real trauma privately without a camera crew. When clips fade, that deafening silence remains the undeniable truth.